Okay, we're about a little less than a quarter of the way down. First word in line is Iboilu. Gmara is now going to deal with a bunch of questions pertaining to slaves, some of which are half slaves, half free men. And first one is a general question. Somebody who's a slave who was freed, but still requires a get shechar, an emancipation document. So, for example, if you make your slave ownerless, or you make your slave hektish, according to one opinion, hektish doesn't actually own your slave. You make him, that means effectively you made him free, but he still requires a document of emancipation. The question is, in this state that he's a free man, but he requires a document. Yesh leknas or ein leknas. Does he have a what's a knas? A knas is a penalty. Explain it as follows: there's when you pay what you damaged, that's a monetary payment. When you pay a fixed amount or more than you damaged, that's a knas. So, for example, if somebody is a robber, here you have to be careful. He's a ganav, which means he came at nighttime. He's sort of a hidden thief, as opposed to a thief that opens the door by day, takes what he wants, and leaves without a gun. If he does it with a gun, that's a ganav also. It's what they call listim mizuyin. An armed robber is the same as coming at night. But if a guy is a thug and he steals by day, he pays back what he stole. Let's say he steals at night, he pays back kefal, pays back double. Kefal is a knas. If a guy steals a sheep or a sheep, shoriset, an ox or sheep or goat, he pays back 4 or 5. 5 for an ox, 4 for a goat or a sheep. Now, there's an interesting rule in general of knas, which is if you admit wrongdoing, you don't pay. You don't pay the knas. Another example of a knas: someone rapes a woman. In addition to damages, there's a flat penalty of 50 shekel. 50 shekels, but it's half what a ksuba is worth. So whatever the value of a ksuba is, this is about half of it. If he admits the rape, then he pays damages, but he does not pay the knas. Another example of knas is if you have a shor hamud, this is a violent animal, and he has history of violence, and he kills a slave. You pay the master 30 coins, and this is true whether the slave is, as long as he wasn't going to die within the next year. That we call a treifa. Then you'd be exempt from paying. But it doesn't make a difference how much he's worth. It could be somebody who's in a vegetable state for the past 10 years and will continue to be, and an animal comes and kills him, still pay the 30 coins. It could be the slave is the most skilled craftsman. He's the pearl driller, right? And it's the same 30 coins. So the question is, in this scenario, the guy owns a slave, but he hasn't yet written out the get shechor, the emancipation. Do you pay the knas or not? Do we say that it has to go to the master? This guy's not the master because the slave is freed. Or do we say, since ultimately speaking, he must get a divorce, a emancipation from the master, he's still called an adon? Tashma, let's try to prove this. If you kill somebody who's half slave, half free man, you pay half a knas, and you also pay chatzi kaifer. Kaifer is the payment that's paid. Now, kaifer is complicated. Whether or not it's a knas, Kaifer again is a payment that's if you have a violent animal who kills a regular person, he pays kaifer. The value of kaifer is the value of the man who was killed. There's a question in the Gemara whether kaifer is monetary payment or whether it's called a kapara. We pass on it's a kapara, but what exactly that means, it's not exactly a knas. It's a way to provide atonement for the one who did not watch his animal. Watch his animal. Okay, but regardless, over here you see you pay half a knas. My love, this Bryson must be going to Mishnah Achrayna, like the later Mishnah. Remember, there's Machlekes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. What do you do about somebody who's half free man, half slave? According to Beis Shammai, you have to free him. According to the first version of it, Beis Hillel, you rotate one day. Now, and then eventually Beis Hillel agreed to Beis Shammai. So my love, it must be this price is going according to the later Mishnah, where you must free him anyway. And even though you're obligated to free him, you still get a half of a knas. This is evidence to the fact that if you have a slave who is not yet completely free because you didn't write out an emancipation, that slave, if he's killed, the knas of 30 coins, killed by a violent animal, goes to the master. And the Gemara's resolution is no, it could be it's going according to the Mishnah Rishona. The Mishnah Rishona is where you can rotate half and half. So then there's no obligation to free the slave, in which case you still own him. That's where you get half of the penalty. Toshma, hippola shinai v'simas einai. General rule is that if you what he says, you disable or you remove a primary organ from the slave, then the slave goes free. So what happens if he knocked out the guy's tooth, right? Or he blinded his eye? Yaitza. I'm sorry. See, he did both. So he knocked out his tooth and he took out he blinded his eye. He blinded his eye. So yaitza b'shinai, he goes out free with his tooth. V'naisen, because he damaged the primary organ. This is again organ here. It doesn't mean in the modern biological sense. V'naisen d'me'enai, and then he has to pay him for the damages to his eye. V'iyam, if you'll say yesh like nas, that somebody who blinds that a slave who's due to be freed has a knas. Uknas l'Rabbi, and the knas goes to the master. Okay, in other words, as follows. Let's say you say that somebody who a slave who requires a divorce document, the penalty still goes to the master. If that's the case, we have a problem here. Over here, presumably, you have to write out a divorce document. Okay, but within 1 minute, you both knocked out his tooth and blinded his eye. Now, if let's say an animal knocked out his tooth, right? Who would the payment go to? It would go to the master, because the master hasn't yet divorced him. He hasn't yet emancipated him. And therefore, if that's the case, why does the master have to pay for blinding him? He hasn't yet been emancipated. Had an animal blinded him at that moment, what would have happened? The owner of the animal would have had to pay the master. So if the master himself blinds him, why should that be any different? Ultimately speaking, if he blinded the slave in one eye before he wrote out an emancipation. So Gemara says there's no proof here because still Maklan Amar ain't it sarach. Who says that when you knock out one of the slave's primary organs, that the slave goes out free? Maybe it's according to the opinion that says that not only does he go free, but he doesn't even require a divorce. The Tanya B'Kulin Rabbi Shmuel says in any method that the slave uses to acquire his own freedom, he still requires an emancipation document. Rameir says, "Ain't it sarach?" It's not necessary. Rabbi Lazar says it is necessary. Rabbi Tarfon, ain't it sarach? Rabbi Tarfon says it's not necessary. Rabbi Kiva says sarach, it is necessary. Those that try to resolve this question in front of the rabbis, they said as follows: Near and diver Rabbi Tarfon, we like the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon that says it's not necessary to get a divorce, b'shein v'ayin, with regard to an organ. Because the Torah specifically says this is a method where the slave can go out freedom, can acquire his freedom. And the opinion of Rabbi Kiva that says we do require a divorce with other organs, not specifically with an eye or a tooth. because those are examples that the Torah gives. Since the Chacham considered it a penalty. So the Gemara says, Kanatsu hakroi kadarshinan. It's not a penalty, it's included in the verses. In other words, the verse specifically mentions a tooth and an eye. So therefore they say a tooth and an eye go out without a divorce. The other ones that are not specific in the Torah, those who require an emancipation. Okay.
You know, for tooth and eye, so as an example, and the other things, would also require the same thing.
So the truth of the matter is that they're really all the same, but because these are more specific,
specifically mentioned.
right?
It's interesting.
Right. Yeah, it is unique. Usually we treat these things as absolutely identical.
Yeah.
Okay, we're about 2/3 the way down. First one in line is in Shechamhu. We're at Ibaylahu. Mu'okav get shecher. Same story, the same guy. He's a Mu'okav get shecher. He's due to he is freed, but he's due to get his document, his emancipation. Eichel b'truma or ein eichel. Can he eat truma or not? Remember, the slave of the Kayin is able to eat truma. Can this guy eat truma or not? Kinyan kasbe and Rahman b'halav kinyan kasbe who? Do we say he needs to be his monetary ownership needs to be owned by the Kayin, and this guy is not, his monetary aspect is not owned by a Kayin? Or do we say, look, ultimately speaking, he needs an emancipation, and therefore he's still called Kinyan Kaspi? Toshma, let's examine this. The Amar of Misharsha, or Misharsha says, this is an unfortunate story. There was a slave and her maidservant that gave birth at the same time. They both gave birth to male children. They both looked identical, and the children got mixed up. So you have two people growing up together in the same household. One's a slave. One of them, the other one, is actually effectively at some point in the future, when the father dies, the master of the other one. So you have a slave and his master, effectively. One's a Kayin, one's not. We don't know who's who. So what do? They can both eat truma. When they go to collect trumas meisters, they can go collect. They need to collect together. The reason why they need to collect together is because we do not allow slaves to collect on their own truma, even if they're eligible to eat. We don't want people confusing them with the kayin. However, over here, if they come together, they can collect together. Higdila they get older. So what do? Mishachar and Zazah, they free each other, and then they both cannot eat truma. We don't know who the kain is. Okay, now ultimately speaking, you have these two kids. Ultimately speaking, what's the end result? They're going to divorce each other, i.e., they're going to write out emancipations to each other. Yet before they've written their emancipations, what happens? They can still eat truma. So you see here somebody who's due to get a get shechar, but he currently doesn't have one. Yet he's still able to eat truma. So what's the problem here? There's no comparison. Over here, in truth, one of these guys is a slave, one of the guys is a master. Just don't know who it is. If Eliyahu came and tell us, we would know who it is. That's full Kinyan Kaspi. You wouldn't have to emancipate each other. If Eliyahu came, Elijah the prophets. Over here, though, the guy is freed already. You've already made him ownerless. He owns himself. Maybe that's not called Kinyan Kaspi. It's not called the monetary ownership of this specific slave. It's not. He's entirely not owned by the master who's a kain. Next interesting question. So, like we mentioned, if a certified violent animal who's owned by a person kills a slave, the payment is 30 coins. It's a flat fee. Let's say the question is, can the master sell the rights to collect knas of this slave? Mocher or eine mocher. So in other words, I'm selling you the right that if my slave gets kicked, killed by a wild animal, but not by a wild animal, by an animal somebody owns that's certified violent, you get to keep the knas. Right? This is sort of an insurance policy here.
Doesn't it give the guy the incentive to make sure the guy gets hurt?
It does, true. Yeah, same can be said about a lot of gambling situations,
That's something, anyway.
Okay. Tiboiler Rameir, Tiboiler Rabbanan. It's a question according to Rameir, it's a question according to the rabbis. Tiboiler Rameir, Atkan like Amar Rameir, Adam Makan Davar Shalom Elam Elkan Paris Dekal David also. Okay, now there's another problem here. This is an event that happens in the future, right? The guy's going to die. Is this considered a Davar Shalom Elam or not? Now remember, Rameir says you could sell a Davar Shalom Elam, and Chacham say you can't. What is a Davar Shalom Elam? Something that isn't present. The classical example of this, the debate between Rameir and the Rabbanan, is whether you can sell the fruits of a tree before they grow. So Rameir says, so let's go examine Rameir. Also, Rameir says you could sell the fruit of a tree. Why? Also, because it typically will come. In other words, presumably you plant a tree, it's going to grow fruit. But over here, who said there will be a certified violent animal that's owned by somebody that's going to kill him? Therefore, it's considered. Therefore, even according to Rameir that says that you could sell a davar shalei b'olam, perhaps this is not even called a davar shalei b'olam. When does Rameir say you can sell a davar shalei b'olam? When it's normal that it would come. When it's likely to come. But over here, there's no indication that it's likely, and therefore perhaps you can sell it. And not only that, the imtim salam or demingach, even if the animal will kill the guy, right? Who said he'll end up paying? Remember, 30 coins is a knas. If you admit what happened, you don't pay the knas. So the guy's animal goes in and kills a slave, then he walks to court the next day, my animal killed a slave. No penalty. No penalty. Okay, so therefore, there's the probability of you getting money here is very, very low. Not only that, if it's Yibayla Rabbanon, it's a question according to the rabbis. The rabbis reject the concept of a davar shalei b'olam. You can't sell something that doesn't exist. You can't sell the fruits of a tree. When did the rabbis say you cannot sell a davar shalei b'olam, something that it isn't present? You can't sell the fruits of a tree because the fruits of a tree are not here today. However, the hashtem yelesnu, because today there are no fruits of the tree. The animal is alive and the slave is alive. So maybe I could sell them because I'm selling you something today. I'm selling you a slave. It's just that you only own my slave with regard to one obscure possibility, which would be if he's killed by a violent wild animal and the guy does not admit wrongdoing. So the Gemara says, what's the story? Okay, now I'm going to cheat over here a little bit. I'll just tell you what the question is, because the question takes you a little bit in circles. The question is a very simple question. The Gemara will prove that there's a slave who is completely worthless. He's absolutely useless. He's worth zero. Maybe he has a long-term, he has a terminal cancer of which the treatment is one of the novel cancer treatments, and it's way more expensive than it'll ever be worth. It'll extend his life by 35 days. As is typical of such things. So is he allowed to eat truma? The answer is he is. Now, the Gemara's question here is, how is it possible for a slave to be absolutely worthless? You could always sell him, that maybe an animal will come and kill him, and there will be a penalty of 30 coins, and that is exactly what I'm selling. Because the guy could be lying in a terminally ill deathbed. Maybe some wild dog will come into the hospital and kill him. It's certified violence, right? And then we'll be able to get the 30 coins, and that value I can sell to somebody else. So how is it possible to have a slave who's completely useless if such a sale is possible? If it's possible to sell a slave for the future potential that maybe he'll be killed and there will be a penalty of 30 coins.
It's like a Deadpool.
What? That in a nutshell is the proof.
It's like one of those reverse,
death insurance annuity things where
Correct.
you're betting against your own
Correct.
longevity.
Correct.
Jeez,
Correct.
foolish. I love it.
Okay. 1 second. Okay. So basically the point here is that it's possible to have a slave who's absolutely worthless. Evidently, such a sale is not possible. Because if it was possible, then you could do it. Then, in other words, then he's not absolutely worthless. There is some small amount of, as he called it, a reverse insurance policy here. So obviously it's not, obviously the Gemara is going to conclude that you cannot make such a sale. And the Gemara's final resolution is that there's no proof because it's possible with a treifa. What does a treifa mean? Somebody who's not going to live for 12 months. If somebody's not going to live for 12 months, then there's no 30 coin payment. Such a person is considered partially dead anyway. And therefore, the animal didn't kill him, he was dead anyway. But he was going to die in the next 12 months. So such a slave would be entirely worthless. A slave who's a treifa. Okay, that's in a nutshell what the Gemara is. We'll just play along for a while until we get to the actual question. Okay, so now we'll take a tangent here until we get back to the original point, which is that it's not possible to have a worthless slave. And the answer is it is because it could be a treifa. Toshma, vilid bias. You're talking about who a kohen is able to feed truma to. A kohen is able to feed truma to a slave who's called kinyan kaspai. He's an acquisition. Kinyan, he was acquired with kaspai, with money, or yilid bias. He was born in the household. Toshma, let's examine this. Yilid bias, ma tamad loimer. Im kinyan kesef oichel yilid bias like kolshkin. If an acquired slave is able to eat truma, i.e. a slave that yesterday belonged to Yisrael and was not able to eat truma, today the kohen bought him, he's able to eat truma. So you live by as somebody who was born into the kohen's house, like Holshkin, he certainly should be able to eat truma. So Mara says, "Ilu kani yisyamer ma kani kesef sheyesh b'shavah kesef oichel. After the bias yesh b'shavah kesef oichel." In other words, I would think if that was the case, that a yilid bias has to be worth something. It has to be value of the yilid bias. In other words, if you gave birth to a child with a severe compromised condition, not you, meaning the slave gave birth to a child in a very compromised condition, that child is worthless. Maybe that child wouldn't be able to eat truma. Even though the child is worthless on the slave market, Talmud Lomer yilid bias mikol makom. So therefore, the verse states, yilid bias, he was born in the house, mikol makom, even if he's entirely worthless. Vayadayani Yomer, I still argue, yilid bias ben sheyesh b'shavah kesef ben she'ein b'shavah kesef. Whether 1 second. In other words, a child who was born into a kohen's house, whether he's worthless or worth something, he's able to eat truma. Kinyan kesef, but if you acquire a slave and then he falls terminally ill, yesh b'shavah kesef oichel, ein b'shavah kesef ein oichel. If he's worth something in the slave market, then he eats truma. If he's not worth something in the slave market, ein oichel, he does not eat truma. So the Gemara says, kinyan kaspai v'yilid beisai. An acquired slave is compared to a slave who was born in. Ma'ilid bayis al pi she'ein shavah klum oichel, kinyan kesef al pi she'ein shavah klum oichel. Both types of slaves, whether they were acquired or born into slavery, they both eat truma. The tell me that a slave can be sold by the master for this penalty of 30 coins if killed by a violent animal and the guy doesn't admit. How is it possible to ever have a slave who's worthless? He could always be sold for this knas. So the Gemara says, it is possible. There's a slave who's not able to live for 12 months, and therefore there's no penalty. So Gemara says, but a treifa is worth something. You can use, just because the guy is terminally ill doesn't mean he can't work at all. He can still work. So Gemara says, we're talking about somebody who has a number of severe compromising conditions that does not allow him to perform any work, including mukushkin. Mukushkin, remember, is a very contagious disease. If you remember, the reason why Rabbi Yehudah ben Levi entered Gan Eden alive and at the end of Hamad during Subas was because he was the only one who had the courage to sort of help these people and provide for their needs. Because Kollel and similar, and was not concerned of catching the illness. Okay, Iboilahu. Question. Next question. Okay, what is the fourth question of the day? Somebody is a half free man, half slave, and he marries a woman who is a regular free woman. What's the halacha? Okay, so now let's take this apart. A man marries a woman, one of two, in one of the following circumstances. The first one is he says, "You are mekudesh to half of me." In that case, the kedushin works because she's entirely mekudeshes. Let's say he says, half of you is married to me. It does not work because you can't marry half a woman. Now, what does it mean that a woman should be married to half of a man? Effectively, what it means is the man can take another wife. However, since a woman can't belong to two husbands, half of the woman cannot be mekudesh, cannot be married, betrothed. Okay. Says so now the question is, what about somebody who's half slave, half free man? Imtim Salimer ben Yisrael Sharmal Bas Yisrael Hiskachi Lechatzi Mekudeshas Lechazi Lekule. Do we say this is comparable to the scenario where he says where the man says to the woman, "You're Mekudesh to half of me"? That works because that woman is able to marry him. What does half of the man mean? It means he could take another wife. But over here, this man is half slave, so therefore she can't actually marry him because she would be marrying a slave. So therefore, the kedushin shouldn't work. Or do we say ben Yisrael Isha where he marries half of the woman? He says, "Half of you should be mekudesh to me." The man says to the woman, "Half of you, the woman, should be mekudesh to me." The man, and mekudeshes, that doesn't work. The shayar b'kinyani, because he didn't marry the other half of the woman. But over here, there was nothing that he left behind. In other words, he did as much as he's married her as much as he's able to. He's ultimately speaking still half a slave. Samai, what's the story? Toshma, let's examine this. We saw this Gemara previously. I pointed out the problem. We'll see the Gemara points at the same problem here. This story, the guy who's half slave, half free man, he's killed by an animal. So what happens? Half of the knas, half of the 30 coins goes to the master. Chatzi knas the rabbi. However, because he's half free man, chatzi kaifer goes to who? The Yarshim, the inheritors. Hold on a second. How exactly does he have inheritors? The amrit kedusha of lav kedushin. If you say that he can't get married, then Yarshim minole. How can he ever have inheritors? The inheritors of a slave, by the way, are not considered inheritors of the man. The child of a maidservant and slave is considered the son or daughter of the mother, but not of the father. There's no fatherly relationship there. So if that's the case, how is it possible for him to have inheritors? Okay, it's talking about where the animal turned him into a treifa, meaning the animal gave him a wound that's so severe he's going to die in 2 months. Okay, and my yarsha, what does it mean that you have to give it to the inheritors? It means nafshay, you give it to him because he's going to die from this wound. Okay, Amarava Sarava did not like this. Shtei Chuvas B'Dover. There's 2 responses. First of all, Chana the Yarshav Tani. Firstly, the Mishnah specifically tells us, talking about Yarshim. V'oid Kaiferhu. We're talking about Kaifer. V'amar Shlagish says Kaifer enim mishtalim el lachar misa. Kaifer is only paid after the guy dies, so you can't pay Kaifer to him if you made him a treifa. You still have to wait until he dies to make the payment of Kaifer. And Amarava Sarava says still no proof. Ro'i lito ve'elai. In other words, the Kaifer should go to his Yarshim, but there are no Yarshim because he doesn't have any inheritors, and therefore it's kept by the owner of the certified violent animal. Okay. Amar Rava. Rava says, okay. So the Gemara here is going to try to give some resolutions to answer these questions, and we'll get to some interesting possibilities hopefully today. Amar Rava. Just like if you marry half a woman, there's no such thing. If you marry a maidservant, a woman who's half maidservant, half free woman, also doesn't work. Dorish Rabbi Barafona said similarly. Just like you can't marry half a woman, can't marry a woman who's half free, half slave. Chizda says to Rava, hold on a second. There's no comparison. When you marry half of a woman, you're leaving behind the other half. And therefore the kinyan doesn't work. But when you marry a woman who's half slave, you're not leaving behind the other half. You can't marry the other half because she's half a slave. So therefore it should work. What happened? Ukim Rabbi Rafuna Amarala. Rabbi Rafuna asked the speaker to get up. The speaker was the modern version of the loudspeaker, except it was an actual person. Right before the days of what they call it, public announcement systems, or modular amplification, you needed the guy. It was a person who had a very loud voice, tenor probably, and he was able to speak super loud. So he told the speaker to get up, and this is what he told him. Fedorish, and he taught as follows. We'll skip the exact derivation here, but what it means here is a reference to is that sometimes in order for a person to understand Torah, he has to make mistakes. That's why I make mistakes so often. It's intentional. I'm kidding. But whatever, part of learning is that you make mistakes, as you can hear on a regular basis. It's not, a person does not get to the proper explanation unless he makes mistakes. Even though somebody who marries half a woman, the kedushin is not valid. If she's half free, half maidservant, then then it's valid. My time, what's the reason? Same reason as Rav Chizda. It depends on whether or not you left over a part of the kinyan. In other words, did you leave behind? Did you leave some sort of ownership behind where you could have acquired more from and you didn't, or not? If you acquired whatever you could acquire, so then she's married. Okay, and the Gemara continues here along these lines. Who goes in which opinion? Amar of Sheshes. You can't marry a woman who's half slave, half free man. So let's say somebody will try to point to you to Shifcha Charufa. Okay, so Rav Sheshes here points to an obvious question. As we mentioned before, we have a category of a woman called Shifcha Charufa. She's a loyal maidservant. And one of the ways you could be a Shifcha Charufa is if you're half slave, half maidservant, and you're married to an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave who's allowed to marry a maidservant. It's also allowed to get married regularly. Okay, if you see that she can get married to an Eved Ivri, evidently she can get married, which means that there is erison. The answer would be, go to Rabbi Shmuel and you'll see you're wrong. Okay, so what does Rabbi Shmuel say? How do we know from Rabbi Shmuel that you're wrong? He says, Rabbi Shmuel says, the Shifcha Charufa is not just half slave, half free woman married to an Eved Ivri. It's also a scenario involving a loyal relationship. Even though slaves, by definition, do not have loyal relationships, there is no marriage with a slave, they could choose to have a loyal relationship. That's called a Shifcha Charufa. If that's the case, is she called Me'ureses? Is she called married? Of course not. Me'ureses just means she's miyuchedes, she's set aside. She agrees to have a loyal relationship. And therefore, because she agrees to have a loyal relationship, that's the title of Charufa and Me'ureses, even though actually, in reality, there is no actual erison. Can a maidservant have erison? What does it mean? What does Me'ureses mean? It means set aside. it doesn't actually mean she can marry a Evet Ivri. It just means that she's set aside. Okay, now we have a very interesting proposition. This is a good, in Yiddish, this would be a chap. Very brilliant chap here. Okay, very interesting. Here it's an interesting possibility. So we have this debate here. Can you marry a half shifcha, half baskaran? Right? Some say you could, some say you can't. Listen to this. So what happened? She got married to Reuven. Then Nishtachar, she was freed. Then she got married to Shimon, Reuven's brother. And then Umeis Shneim, they both died. Could she do Yibum to Levi? So he says, Levi. She could do Yibum to Levi. Why? But if you say the Kedushin is valid, then she's married to Reuven. If you say the Kedushin is not valid, she's married to Shimon. So either way, she's married to one of the brothers, and therefore she can do Yibum. I don't consider her married to both. I consider her married only to one. If Reuven's marriage was valid, because you hold the opinion that Chatzi Baskarim could get married, so then Kedushin to Reuven to Shimon Lav Kedushin. Then she's not married to Shimon. The Kedushin to Shimon Kedushin to Reuven Lav Kedushin. And if you say the Kedushin of Shimon are valid, then Reuven's Kedushin is not valid. And therefore, she could do Yibum because she's married regardless to one brother. Okay, let's just briefly review here. All the questions, lots of questions here. Okay, first question we discussed was if somebody is waiting for get shechor, do they get the penalty of 30 coins or not? That remained unresolved. The next question was, 1 second. Same person, can he eat truma or not? Third question was, in other words, someone who's waiting for get shecher, can he eat truma? Third question was, can you sell a slave for knas? Is this considered a davar shalei bala olam or not? In the circumstance where the guy dies, can he be sold or can't he be sold? And the fourth question was, what is this? Can a man who's half free, half slave, can he sell himself? Can he marry a woman? Can he acquire a woman through marriage? And then we had the major debate with the reverse scenario: half free woman, half maid servant. Can she get married? We had a debate. And then we had Kizda tell us, he doesn't know the answer to the debate, but he knows that it's a certain answer one way or the other. She is eligible to even for certainty. Either certainly she's married to Reuven or she's certainly married to Shimon. Okay. Pleasure. Yeah, fun stuff.